so here we go. Time to guess the moves. Alright, so e4. Knight c3, knight c6, 4 g6, knight f3, bishop g7, 5 knight d4. Okay, so this is Grand Prix. Bishop b5 Grand Prix. Okay, so black's starting to take the two bishops. White just allows it. This is all theory. Okay, do you guys know what black should do here? Anybody? Anybody? My mic is terrible. Your mic is terrible, buddy. Your mic is I mean, it should be the same as ever. Yeah, it should be the same as always. I don't know what would have changed. Okay, so what should black do? Yeah, so a natural thing would be to expand on the queen side, but how exactly do I go about it? So the problem is if I play something like a6 immediately, then after bishop d3, try b5, then a move like knight takes d4 makes sense. And after pawn takes knight e2, basically white's going to play c3 and bring the bishop back and play d4. It's not really clear what my queenside expansion has done. I mean, it's a possibility, but queen b6 is also possible. But after a move like knight d5, it's not clear that I have anything better than queen d8. I can't take the bishop, unfortunately, because of this fork.
Check.
And my queen's attacked. So queen b6 kind of just runs into that. Yeah, if knight takes e4, you always want to take with the pawn, because the pawn helps control these squares and also opens the c file. You have a natural target on c2, which is important. So yeah, you don't play bishop takes. Bishop takes is a big mistake. Because the problem is, like, okay, so say I just play a6. Yeah, so if you play bishop takes, the problem is, like, now I can play e5 and trap this bishop. And I'm going to play knight e2 and c3 anyway. And if you play a move like c4, I can just play bishop e2. And it's not really clear that you've actually gained anything. Because this bishop is now coming to f3. And like I said, e5 is coming. And this knight finds not a happy home. Okay, so what should black play here? No, this is not a Rosslimo. This is a Grand Prix. Yeah, so it makes sense to take the bishop first. So knight takes bishop, knight takes knight. Okay, so that's the first step. So now black has the two bishops. Black has the two bishops. Good. Okay, but now what? Because ideally, black would like to play this move. right? But the problem is if I play d5, then after take, obviously I get
check.
forked 3 ways from Sunday. This is on Internet Chess Club, DLZ. But I mean, we're just going over a game, so I'm not really playing. Okay, so what should I do here after knight takes b5? If I play a move like knight f6, then again e5 and d4 is coming quickly. I want to try to get this guy out. Right, so queen b6 is possible, but the problem is after queen b6, again, white can just play knight c3. And now I'd have to play a move like d6. And it's not entirely clear that this queen is well posted on b6. You know, white's just going to play like d3 and knight d5. And maybe start trying to play f5. And also queen b6 prevents this pawn from moving forward. And one of the main ideas for black here is to expand on the queen side. So you have to be careful that you don't put your pieces in front of your pawns that want to expand. Yeah, and b6, it's actually, this bishop probably does not want to be on this diagonal. Probably wants to control this diagonal. So b6 is probably a mistake, because also this pawn actually wants to go to b5. So if anything, you'd want to play like a6 and b5 rather than b6. So what's the right move here, guys? Well, the right move here is actually to play d5 anyway. And the point is that after white plays pawn takes pawn, we're actually not going to take back, but we're simply going to play a6. And now after this knight moves, so if the knight moves to a3, then of course queen takes d5. But if knight c3, then we simply play knight to f6. And now we're winning this pawn back. And black is perfectly fine, because now black can easily play b5, b4 if he wants. His pieces are better than white's pieces. And this is just very comfortable. So black played d5. But rather than capturing on d5, white decided to play this move e5. Okay, so e5. So now what? So now what? So the knight on b5 has this natural square on c3 to retreat to if I play a6. And then if I play d4, then white can play knight e4. Hit this guy. So black plays d4. The point being that now if this knight is going to retreat, it has to go back to a3. So d4. So white tries to remove this pawn and play c3. Okay, now what should black play? Because white's threatening to win a pawn by taking twice. So we have to do something about that. Okay. So a6 makes a lot of sense. Yeah, good. So now this knight has to move. So knight a3 is forced. Okay, now the question is what to do. Now the question is what to do. Tricky. Because there are a few reasonable options here. So one possibility is kind of to play a move like b5 maybe. And just expand on the queen side. But yeah, the move d3 though is tricky because it actually involves sacrificing a pawn. You guys see why d3 why d3 loses a pawn? Does anyone here see why d3 loses a pawn? Yeah, knight h6 is also possible, actually. Knight h6 is also possible. The idea is that, I mean, you're also losing a pawn there, but the idea is that you get good compensation on the d file. So, for example, after take, queen a4 check, b5, queen takes d4, just bishop b7. So, for example, so knight h6, take, check, block, and after queen takes d4, just a move like castle. And so white's up a pawn, but like this bishop has real problems. And this knight is kind of stuck too, so knight t2. Or actually, on queen a4, maybe even just b5. And then, okay, so take, castle, knight c2, bishop b6, something like this. And black's going to have good pressure on the d file and on the c file, which compensates for being down a pawn. And this knight's going to hop into f5. And the two bishops are quite strong. So this is possible. Okay. So d3 is also possible. Here. d3 is also possible. But again, it involves the sacrifice of a pawn. So the way that white wins a pawn here is after d3, plays queen a4 check. And now no matter how I block, there's going to be a fork at the end. So the problem is, like, if I play a move like queen d7, he can just trade queens and win this pawn on d3, like this. If I go rook d8, then I think just like h3 or something. Although maybe he doesn't rush to trade queens. Okay, maybe he just plays like here. With the idea of just playing this and this. And if I block this way, now queen e4 hits this. And so rook b8, queen c6.
Check.
And now this pawn is hanging on c5. But Um, but black has good compensation here because of this pawn on d3. So this is actually what happened in the game. So black played d3 and white played queen a4 check. B5. So knight takes b5 doesn't work because of bishop d7. Obviously, if I take, then queen takes a8, but bishop d7 and now the knight's pinned. And now c4 just pawn takes. So that's why b5 works. Okay, but white played queen e4, hitting this. Rook b8, and now queen c6 check. Okay. So now the question is how to block. How to block. There are two choices: queen d7 or bishop d7. Not king f8. That's not king f8. I mean, they're about the same. But black played queen d7. Okay, white played queen c5. Now black needs to finish development, so knight h6. Queen d4. Okay, so now the question is what to do here. Question is what to do here. Should we be fine with the queen trade? Yeah, so queen d7, yeah, is better because otherwise, yeah, he could potentially take a6. Too. I'm not sure that he would, but yeah, queen d7 is probably more principled. Okay, but what now for black? Yeah, I mean knight f5 is playable, but the problem is if you play knight f5 too quickly, white can just play g4. So for example, like if knight f5 here, then take, and g4 might be a bit of an issue. Because now the knight has to go back to h6, right? And then white can just play h3. And I'm not sure that black wants to rush into knight f5. Yeah, so queen f5 continues to defend the pawn, but notice that after queen f5, now white can just play knight to e1, and now actually we lose the pawn. So the problem is that the black or white is quasi-threatening to do something like knight e1 here. If black's not careful. But yeah, after queen f5, you can't defend the pawn a second time. And if black loses that pawn, then it's an issue. But black simply castled just to get his other rook into the game. And so white captured on d7. Okay, so black has to take. And now white played f or b3. Okay. So now what should black do? So black's down a pawn, but I mean black has two bishops. The pawn on d3 is kind of entombing the knight on a3. The bishop on c1 is also quite bad. The rook on a1 is dead. All black pieces are out more or less. He has open c file, open d file. But I mean, he is down a clear pawn, so. So what should black play here? So black needs to start getting his pieces going. Particularly, black's piece that he'd like to get going is this bishop on g7. So the way to do that is to simply play f6 and create a target on e5. So, I mean, black's idea is simply that he wants to take on e5, and if pawn takes, then knight g4 hits this pawn a second time. And if knight takes, then maybe just take the rook, and then play knight g4 and fork some pawns. So, for example, if, you know, let's say black plays, or white plays rook a1, rook b1 or something. So you can go like take, and knight g4, winning his pawn back in a good position. Because now this rook is coming into the game as well. So f6 was a principled move, just to give the bishop some scope and to create a target. So f6 was played. Okay, and now white took. Okay, so the question is how to recapture back. There are 3 choices. So what do you guys think about the recapture? What should black do? So by taking with the bishop or the rook, you keep the lines open, but by taking with the pawn, you fix the pawn structure. So is it more important to have a healthier pawn structure, or is it more important to have open lines? The age-old question. Open lines or better pawn structure? So the answer is pawn structure. Open lines are actually not going to do much in this position quite yet. But pawn structure is key. So for example, if after e takes f6, black were to play rook takes f6, the problem is after knight e5, black's in some trouble. Because now there's a fork of these 2 pieces. So black would have to play bishop f5 here. But now white can start playing h3 and g4. And notice that actually black's pieces are clogging up his own lines. This rook is clogging up this bishop's clogging up this rook, this knight is kind of stuck. So by actually opening up lines, it actually causes more problems than it helps. I mean, again, this isn't terrible, but I believe it's most accurate to recapture with the pawn. Because now, don't forget, now we have an open line here, which is actually somewhat dangerous. And now this knight can feel more confident hopping into f5 because it has a potential home on e4, supported by a pawn on f5. So notice like a knight on e4 really does a great job of controlling the key squares. So pawn takes is probably the most principled. Yeah. So, okay. So now white played bishop to b2. Natural to develop the bishop and get the rook out. Okay. Good. What should white do? Or sorry, what should black do? What should black do? So it seems natural that we'd want to position one of our rooks on a better file. But the question is which file and which rook? So, you know, the E file looks promising, the C file looks promising, potentially even the D file. But the question is, which rook to which file? There's a clear answer, but which one is it? So the file to control is going to be the E file, obviously, because it's open. There's really nothing going on the C file, right? I mean, being on the C file doesn't accomplish anything, really. But the E file is where the action is going to take place. So the question is, which rook? The F rook or the B rook? And it might not seem like it makes a big difference, but it actually does. So it matters which rook in this case. It's not just a matter of taste. It's really important. So the question is, which rook? So the right answer is rook F8. And the reason is this bishop is coming here. So rook F8 is the reason rook F8 is to give the bishop F8 to play bishop C5. Because that's how the bishop's coming out. This pawn on F6 is doing a good job of controlling these squares. So we don't want to play F5. Do not want to play F5. But we do want to get our bishop out. So part of the reason why we played pawn takes here instead of rook takes or bishop takes is that we wanted to get the bishop out. And so rook F8 accomplishes that. So after rook E1, rook AE1, now we simply continue. Bishop F8. Capture, capture. Rook E1. Okay, now what? Now what? Up to this point, I mean, both sides have almost played perfectly. Neither side has really made any major mistakes. White has a pawn, but black has, you know, really good compensation, and it's really unclear how white actually makes progress in this position. So this position is fairly level, and both sides have played quite well so far. Okay, so what should black do here? Yeah. So bishop c5 check makes a lot of sense. Rook e2. The problem is like he can just take and play king f2. So rook e2 take king f2, and then now my pawn's lost on e2. So I can't do that. But what black can do is simply play bishop c5 check.
Check.
King f1 and rook takes e1.
Check.
And of course, now white takes back with the knight to threaten this. So black must defend this pawn. Of course, if knight g4, b4, knight takes h2 is mate, which is
checkmate.
cute. But of course, white would just take on d3. Now king e2 is legal. Although
check. Check.
This king is actually in a little bit of trouble. King can go to e1 though. But okay. But bishop f5 is really the only move that makes sense. So bishop f5 to defend the pawn. b4. Okay, so now where should the bishop go back to? Okay, so black wants to create a threat. So it's always good to combine attack and defense. So black plays bishop d6, hit f4. And now white lashes out, trying to free his position. Plays the move c4. Okay, now the question is what to do as black. Now the question is what to do as black. Yeah, b6 is definitely not right, because you want to maintain control of this pawn. But also you want to maintain control of this pawn. Okay, so now what? Now what? c4, now black has options. Question is what to do here. Yeah, well, everything is hanging. I mean, this is hanging, this is hanging, this is hanging, this is hanging. A lot of stuff is hanging. The question is what to do. Yeah, so it turns out they're actually both roughly equivalent. Taking on b4, taking on f4 are about the same. They're both good. So for example, if take is strong, and also take take is good as well. Okay, so black actually chose to play bishop takes b4. And white played c takes b5. Okay, now the question is what to do. Again, a lot of choices. Take this guy, you can take this guy, you can take this guy. Okay, so probably what black should do is take on b5. And now if white takes on b5, black will take on d2, and this pawn becomes very strong. Black simply threatening to move the bishop away and queen the pawn. So after take, white should probably play bishop c1 to defend this pawn. And now black should play bishop d6 with a dual threat. One is to remove this pawn from capture, and the other is to take this. So depending on what white does, so if white takes on b5, black will take on f4. And again, this pawn's not going to go very far. And this knight's kind of stuck. And if you play g3 or something, then black can play b4. But black instead immediately took on d2, which is also reasonable. And now white took on a6. Now this pawn is fast, but so is this pawn. Okay. So what now? Yeah, it's very drawish here. It's very drawish. So what should black do here? Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, like knight g4 runs into knight f3 with knight c4 coming. The blockade on d2, and then this pawn can start rolling. Bishop e3 is good because it stops a7 and also threatens d2. But after knight c4, bishop a7, still tricky. Still tricky because now white has an idea to just play bishop c1 to e3 maybe. And notice that on e3 it covers d1. And this pawn is quite quick. But bishop e3 is the best try. e3 is the best try. Black instead played bishop takes f4, which is also reasonable. With the idea that if a7, now black can play bishop e4. And then if knight takes d3, just bishop e. Now this pawn. Or sorry, actually you can take with check.
Check.
Sorry. So you can't take on d3 yet, but yeah, now black's idea is he just wants to play like bishop d6 to c. And again, a draw is probably the likely outcome here. Okay, but after bishop takes f4, white instead tried knight f3. And now, do you see what black can do here? Black has a strong resource at his disposal. Okay, so what black did here is he played d2, and now threatening d1 queen. So king e2 forced, but now we have a little trick. The trick we have is bishop d3.
Check.
And now the king can't take the bishop because of d1 queen, and we have a fork. So all of a sudden, black gets rid of the pesky a6 pawn. And this is good. So king d1, bishop takes a6. Bishop takes f6. And now what? And now what? So now we can take on h2, of course. Knight h2, knight d2. Or sorry, knight h2, bishop h2, king d2. Okay. Now, how can black win a pawn here? How can black win a pawn here? No, I'm still here, buddy. Still here. So how can black win a pawn here? Yeah, very good. Bishop e7. Because now I'm threatening this guy. And if he moves it, then I win the other guy. So bishop e7, 4. Now bishop d5. So I gain a tempo in order to get to d5 so I can take a2. So knight b5. Bishop takes a2. Okay, the question is, can black win this position? So what do you guys think? Can black win this position? So, unfortunately, the answer is probably not. Eventually, what's going to happen is some sort of thing where where black eventually, if he's lucky, can trade off these pawns. And then all white has to do is sacrifice his knight for the last pawn. Because two bishops don't beat a bishop, unfortunately. Two bishops can mate, but not if black has a bishop. So basically the idea is, if it's two bishops against a bishop, white will just put his king in the corner of his bishop's color and just keep his bishop on this diagonal forever. There's nothing that black can really do to flesh out the king, because the bishop will cover all the checks on the diagonal. So really the only way for black to try to win is if he can somehow win this pawn for nothing. But for example, if knight c3, bishop e6, just g5. And for example, bishop f4, bishop
Check.
e3. And trading bishops doesn't actually help, because the knight can always just cover the pawns. And even in some situations, white can get into like a wrong color rook pawn and bishop versus king, you know? Like if we trade all these guys, then this bishop is not on the right color to help the queening of the pawn. So this is actually probably a draw. But yeah, two bishops versus knight can actually probably be won. It requires a lot of technique, but I think that can be won. Because I think you can like trap the knight eventually, in theory. But yeah, I don't think white ever has to allow that. Yeah, so if black plays g5, okay, well, it's white's move here. It's white's move here. So white played knight c3. And of course black hallucinated immediately, but assuming black doesn't hallucinate and moves his bishop and plays bishop e6, I mean, black has to move his bishop is the point. So as soon as black moves his bishop, white will play g5. Is the problem. So yeah, I mean, if black could play g5 first, it's possible because he fixed the pawn on light square. But I think even then the king can get to f3 in time, and it's still tricky. Because now all of a sudden the pawn on g5 becomes a target to this bishop, and even if h6 is played, then maybe the bishop can come around this way, because the king will eventually have to come in somehow, and then h6 will be weak. But in any case, it kind of went to a draw very quickly because black hallucinated and played king f7, which you guys couldn't have possibly guessed, and then knight takes e2 and king e6 is just a draw. Because after king e3, h5. And now after g takes h5, just bishop g1 check.
Check.
King move, bishop takes, king takes, and the draw. So even if black had moved his bishop, it was probably still going to be a draw. But he could have, tried to press on for a few more moves. But it was a fairly well played game by